talk about peace from the inner to the international, and that there's an emerging narrative arising around the world. So that's what I'm going to focus on. Just briefly, how I came into this. Growing up in Indiana, Catholic family, went off to the Peace Corps, Sierra Leone for 4 years, 85 to 89. Lived with subsistence farmers, fell in love with my friends, lived with, my friends lived on less than $1 a day. So that was a dramatic awakening to see that I didn't need much in order to feel a deep sense of connectedness and belonging and happiness, even though it was a harsh environment. After I left there, I really started questioning the pursuit of happiness, started meditating a couple hours a day, met some yogis along the way, Mickey Singer, author of The Untitled Soul. And then Sierra Leone went into a bloody, chaotic civil war, fueled by the global economy, where blood diamonds, timber trade were used to buy AK-47 and other weapons. I was just passionate. I wanted to work on peace building. And so what happened is, one thing led to another, and I got to work with Search for Common Ground, which is one of the world's leading conflict transformation organizations. And I worked with them for 14 years. In 1998, I got to go back to Sierra Leone on an assessment mission. The rebels had been pushed back. We went up into the bush. A BBC person had been killed earlier that week on the same road. Got back to the village. It was a joyous reunion. Got to see some of my friends and also hear about the impact of the war. Afterwards, came across a mob killing of a young rebel, and then came back to D.C., and then within a week or two, New York's Times had a cover story of the war having come back through where I was, and there was a woman with both arms cut off on the front page of the paper. This threw me deeper into my meditation practice. At that time, I threw myself at the feet of the Divine Mother, wanted to know how in the world this could happen, began to have these ecstatic experiences of just profound love. And then I got to go back to Sierra Leone in 2000, and then Liberia, Congo, Angola, Burundi, all across sub-Saharan Africa, while going in and out of these ecstatic states, while working on tangible peace building projects that were dramatically transforming entire societies. Some of the things that I learned in that was, one, is that inner peace is a global responsibility. Both villages I lived were sacked by rebel units with child soldiers. One boy was a head of a rebel unit, was named Colonel Rambo, who was trained by watching Rambo movies. Our lifestyle, the few hundreds of millions of people that are massively consuming, is not only impacting the environment, but impacted literally the people I live with. Some friends were killed, some were raped, and many were beaten. So inner peace is a global responsibility. The other thing I became aware of is that conflict is absolutely natural. And I go into greater detail in here about it's really the metaphysics of feeling separated from source that creates a conflict internally that then manifests across the world. It's a little bit more complex than that. The other thing I became aware of is that there was an incredible arising out of the shattering of the human heart all across sub-Saharan Africa, and then later trips to Nepal, India, China, Macedonia, where I was meeting thousands of peace builders doing incredible work. And what I could see is that there was similarities to the deep meditation practice I was maintaining, and then likewise the tangible ways of working on peace on the outside. That there were a lot of the same principles that we would apply to ourselves to go into communion with the divine that were being applied. For example, in Burundi, within a year of the genocide of Rwanda next door, we had Hutus and Tutsis co-producing radio programs. One woman had lost 79 members of her family to ethnic violence, and yet she was co-producing radio programs with people from the other ethnic group. They were modeling compassion, tolerance, and forgiveness. And then I go into great detail about how they were really leveraging consciousness on a societal level. Within a few years, they had 90% of the country listening to the radio programs and documented change in attitudes and behavior. So based on this, I knew that there was a continuum from inner to international that was emerging. And it wasn't until the last two and a half years that I got a chance to really start to explore this. I joined the Shift Network to work on something called the Summer of Peace. And in the Summer of Peace, what we did to set it up, next slide please, is the first thing we did is we trained 600 peace ambassadors around the world, including Cynthia, who's here, And looking at peace on the deep inner part, James O'D Lee faculty is a dear friend. He used to work at Amnesty International, and also the head of the Institute of Nordic Science. So he designed a curriculum that looks at deep interpersonal peace, then moves to healing personal collective wounds, communicating peace, and then systems change, and then activating organizing for peace. Next one, please. The next thing we did is we created a Youth Rising for Peace Summit where every hour, on the hour, we interviewed young peace builders around the world. We went all the way around, and what this did, it was a way of bringing a voice and face to the fact that there is a wave of peace emerging. Next one, please. The next thing we did is we created the Summer of Peace Telesummit. And this was the first time that I know of that there was a comprehensive mapping of peace from inner to international across 15 sectors of society. We had business, education, communication, arts and culture, forgiveness, nonviolence, military. And so we co-produced this with many partners. Institute of Nordic Science did a whole week interviewing scientists looking at peace. And then we also had the Alliance for Peace Building, which is working closely with people in the Pentagon, a whole week interviewing people from the military looking at peace. What this telesummit has done is started to create this new narrative of peace, again, from inner to the international. And by having this bird's eye view and having the background in 20-some years of meditation, is I started to see that there's a lot of common themes that are emerging. Basically, the divine consciousness is arising and then giving expression to people in ways that are culturally appropriate. And then we can see the similarities. For instance, the theme of interdependence, interconnectedness. We had a Sunday series where all the mystics talked about this, every Sunday interviewing different mystics. Well, Chief Phil Lane Jr., we did a one-day telesummit with him on Eagle, reunion of the Condor and the Eagle, and he's saying, this is a part of the indigenous wisdom. We interviewed Colonel Puck Mickleby, a retired Marine, when he was at the Pentagon, was asked to create a new grand strategy for America. He worked with a captain from the Navy. After they did all this research, he realized we don't need a strategy, we need a new narrative. And his narrative that came out says, sustainability is the highest national priority for the United States. The world is incredibly interdependent, interconnected. We need to focus on a foreign policy that is based on values and credibility. You can see the fingerprints of how this consciousness is arising. And so what we've been focused on is bringing more and more attention to this narrative. We interviewed Meta World Peace, who used to be with the LA Lakers, a bad boy in basketball, really working hard to transform his consciousness around anger. He said, I keep coming back to my breath. A few days later, we interviewed Cynthia Bourgeot, and she said, keep coming back to your breath. We also interviewed Will and Cynthia, looking at healing collective wounds. And so from this bird's eye view, we know there is an emergence. Now, a beautiful thing that happened is every Sunday we interviewed different mystics. And we designed a series with David Nichol from the Gaia Field Project, who did his PhD on subtle activism, how prayer and meditation actually influences individuals in society. And when we started this, we mapped out the different traditions, wanting to make sure we could tap into the lineages and create a subtle field of activism. And when we did this, towards the end of the first year, David said, I think we need to do a synchronized global meditations on the International Day of Peace. And so he organized this, and this just came together quickly. The next one, please. And it came together quickly where...
Should I play it?
Not yet. Where suddenly it's just like all these groups came together. Meanwhile, I was asked by the United Nations to speak at the first ever United Nations high-level forum on a culture of peace. And Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General, opened the session, presented the fact that there is this narrative from the inner to the international that includes the mystics, includes the military, includes the scientists, includes the sports figures, includes all these people. And the UN caught on to it, like this theme of inner to international is huge. I just published an article with the Contemplative Journal, which is going to be republished in China by the United Nations, looking at this theme of inner to international. So a big part of this new narrative is looking at what's the culturally appropriate language, looking at the diverse stakeholders and allowing them to speak close to one another. So you have Colonel Puck Nickleby and Chief Phil Lane together, also Andrew Harvey. You know, Andrew Harvey's take was the Divine Mother, has a dark, ferocious side, and she's pissed off. And he said other things which aren't appropriate to be recorded. And so when you start taking these diverse folks, then what we do is we bring to life the wisdom of all these different traditions. And we're seeing how they're being applied. And, and a big part of this is coming out of the shattering of the heart. Azim Kamisa, who we interviewed, his only son was killed by a 14-year-old boy in gang violence. He went through 40 days of incredible sorrow. And then at the end of that, his teacher said, "You must work for peace in the name of your son." He reached out to the grandfather of the boy who killed his son, went to meet the boy in prison, said, "You have a job waiting for you when you come out to work to help youth to avoid this kind of violence." There's so many stories of the shattering of the heart that I could tell that I've witnessed. And it's through that shattering and that crisis that this wake-up is happening. Let's go ahead and show this video. When David started this, he said, well, we hope to have a few cities around the world participating. They had 248 cities last year participating. This year he was hoping to have 500. They had 561 meditation groups in cities around the world participating in this wave of subtle activism. So what this speaks to is that there is a new narrative arising around the world. And what we're going to be doing next is, there's an advisor to the Pentagon who's advising us on how we can take this to a larger scale. He said, I love what you're doing for Summer of Peace. It needs to reach more people. It needs to reach more people. So we're going to be working with him over the next several months on a strategy that he thought of on how we can take this to the next level. In closing, I want to quote Steve Killalea, who created the Global Peace Index. Has anybody heard of the Global Peace Index? He measures the most peaceful countries in the world based on indicators, and New Zealand and Iceland are battling it out on who's the most peaceful. And he also measures the economic impact of a lack of peace. And when we interviewed Steve Killalea, I added the first two lines to this, but he said, basically, Sanskrit has 108 words for love, Islam has 99 names for God, Japanese has 14 words for beauty. We've got one word for peace. We don't have enough words to accurately describe all the different types of peace. I think it was Socrates who once said, if you don't have a word to describe something, then how can you think about it? So by focusing on this new narrative of peace, one of the intentions is, in the next generation, to have 108 words for peace. Steve really pointed out that we're really at only the beginning to understanding peace. Again, from the inner to the international. And yet, meanwhile, there's been this groundswell. I mean, you think about the number of people practicing meditation yoga today. Had dramatically grown in the last few decades. Golf has now replaced, yoga has now replaced golf as the number one form of relaxation for lawyers in the United States. The number of conflict and peace and conflict resolution programs went from a handful in 1984 to hundreds around the world. The number of community mediation centers has grown exponentially. Alternative dispute resolution has grown. So it's happening. It's happening. The key is to take the lens of a mystic, look at what's emerging, look at the common principles, and then look at the language that speaks to people. So we're going to work side by side with people from the military to help bring out what this new narrative of peace is. Thank you.
we've got time for a couple questions.
Yeah.
Just that last sentence, could you flesh that out a little more? You said we're going to work side by side with the military.
There's an anonymous advisor to the Pentagon who has an idea that we're going to do the R&D on. And he's agreed to be the advisor on it. It's basically, how do we take the new narrative and mainstream it? And so we'll be working with him closely on developing that strategy. And then meanwhile, we'll take our media library and then lay it out so it's laid out according to sectors so people can start to get a visual also to see it first.
Just like as a 25-year Navy wife, to point out that not all military members are militaristic. That some of them believe in peace through strength, some of them believe that it's a good job, it comes with health benefits. Some of them know that if our country was endangered, they would respond to a call to defend the country, and so they decide to prepare themselves, and that was my husband's path.
Yeah, I want to honor that in two ways. One is, I lived in Sierra Leone that went to hell in a handbasket. And it took the UN, West African peacekeepers, United Nations, and finally the British paratroopers go in there and stop the chaos. I mean, we had 8-year-old boys carrying AK-47s. I have a tremendous respect for professional military and the role they played in peacekeeping.
And that's not what you had there.
It was unbelievable what happened. And they did not have a professional military. The other aspect is we had, from the Alliance for Peacebuilding, Chip House was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War. And he is working closely with military because he's saying that some of the most forward thinking on climate change and peacebuilding is coming from the strategic thinking of military. The person we're working with, his mind is brilliant on strategy. And he's helping us to apply it in this way.
And so I have to let you know that the phrase "cultivate peace" comes from the Stanford Affirmation that my husband wrote with my help when he was in medical school. It's the new oath that medical students take when they become doctors. It's been changed since then, but that origin was an insight of a man who was coming into service.
Yeah, and I have pronounced, plus just the spiritual warrior energy is so powerful, and that archetype, I mean, that archetype when it's applied is fierce, and then you bring that in with the divine feminine, which is arising. All of this is the divine feminine that's rising. I go into greater detail in that, how it's really tangibly the feminine. It's just like, it's got to be fierce to stand in the face of incredible, basically evil, when you've got thousands of child soldiers being manipulated. I mean, that is not light. And so you got to bring the fierce light to it. Yeah, you had.
I think that's all the time we have.
On that, have you reached Barack Obama?
Have we reached Barack Obama?
Have you had a conversation with him?
One of my colleagues did a project that brought diverse stakeholders together to move away from this polarized approach to look at how to improve relationship with Muslim countries. 2-year dialogue that we saw, it had Madeleine Albright, conservative Republicans, Muslims. It came out with a report that Madeleine Albright says Barack Obama has clearly read this because in his inaugural speech, it had recommended that he reach out to Muslims around the world. And so some of my colleagues have reached him with some of these ideas.
Have you seen the film, just quickly, Fumble Talk? I highly recommend it.
I've seen it. It's hard to watch. I mean, the places where I lived for 4 years
Really
went through that
beautiful,
hell.
But the resolution and the healing. that
Yes,
came to
and
me.
it's powerful. And there's a whole subject to be explored about how you can really take an entire community through a transformation of the shadow. And it's a phenomenal film.
Yeah, it's Fumble Talk on Sierra Leone, His Family Talk in Creole. FAMBOLTOK.
Okay, we need time to set up the next
Okay.
group, so thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.